regular American soldier patrolling the military base in the morning, and a dangerous intelligence operative in East German territory at night. Elvis Presley's secret second identity, hidden for 60 years, was one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets. Now, for the first time, we're telling the story of the king of rock and roll's adventures behind the Iron Curtain, March 24, 1958. America's most beloved entertainer stood on the steps of the Memphis Draft Board, his famous pompadour freshly shorn into a military buzz cut. As flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted questions, Private Elvis Presley gave a crisp salute. "The Army can do anything it wants with me," he told the press with his characteristic Southern charm. "They're not going to treat me any different from anybody else." At least that was the official story. What the public didn't know, what nobody would know for decades, was that Elvis's military service would be anything but ordinary. Behind the publicized images of the rock star peeling potatoes and doing push-ups lay a classified operation that would utilize the singer's unique talents for something far more important than boosting military morale. Operation Blue Suede, as it was code-named in classified documents, represented one of the most audacious intelligence gambits of the Cold War era. And it all began with a simple observation by CIA analyst Martin Hewitt in late 1957. The Soviets are increasingly concerned about American cultural influence on their youth. They fear nothing more than the power of rock and roll to inspire rebellion. And no one embodies that power more than Elvis Presley. When Elvis received his draft notice, most assumed it was bad timing for the young star. His career was red hot, with hit records dominating the charts and Hollywood calling. Many expected him to join the Special Services Entertainment Division, following in the footsteps of stars like Tony Bennett, performing for the troops rather than serving alongside them. But someone in military intelligence saw a different opportunity. Recently declassified documents reveal a meeting that took place on February 12, 1958, at the Pentagon. Present were representatives from Army Intelligence, the CIA, and the State Department. The topic: how to leverage Elvis Presley's upcoming military service for national security purposes. A memo from this meeting, stamped top secret, eyes only, outlines the basic framework of Operation Blue Suede. Subject's extraordinary popularity and recognition makes conventional intelligence work impossible. However, this same recognition factor creates unique opportunities for cultural intelligence gathering and potential influence operations in sensitive areas, particularly in Germany, where subject will be stationed. In other words, Elvis was too famous to be a traditional spy, but that same fame could be weaponized in ways a regular operative never could be. By March 1958, the operation was green-lit at the highest levels. Elvis would publicly serve as a regular soldier, with no special treatment, a cover story that would please the public and maintain his all-American image. But behind the scenes he would be trained for specialized intelligence work, focused particularly on youth movements behind the Iron Curtain. Elvis shipped out to Germany in September 1958, assigned to the 3rd Armored Division in Freiburg. To the world it looked like the king of rock and roll was just doing his patriotic duty. In reality, he was beginning one of the most extraordinary classified missions of the Cold War. In Anmaya, the genius of Operation Blue Suede lay in its use of Elvis's natural persona. He wasn't asked to become someone else, just to be himself in specific places at specific times, and to keep his eyes and ears open. The subject possesses a natural charisma, an ability to engage strangers in conversation, noted his handler, Captain William Taylor, whose real name remains classified. He demonstrates an exceptional memory for details and shows intuitive understanding of social dynamics. These are qualities we typically spend years trying to develop in field operatives. Elvis's training was conducted in the evenings, after his regular military duties. In a small nondescript building on the Freiburg base, he received crash courses in basic tradecraft, dead drops, counter-surveillance, memory exercises, and rudimentary German language focused on intelligence gathering rather than conversation. He picked things up faster than almost anyone I've trained, Captain Taylor would later recall in a declassified oral history. He had this performer's ability to observe and mimic, I'd show him something once and he'd have it down. Not to mention his ability to charm information out of people was, well, it was something we couldn't teach. The first phase of Elvis's mission was simple observation. His presence in Germany naturally attracted attention. Whenever he went into town, crowds would gather. Among those crowds were young Germans from both sides of the increasingly tense divide between East and West. Elvis was instructed to engage these fans in conversation, asking innocuous questions about music, culture, and everyday life. What bands were popular in the East? What were the challenges of getting Western records? How did authorities respond to rock and roll? These seemingly casual conversations provided valuable intelligence about the mood behind the Iron Curtain and the effectiveness of Soviet cultural restrictions. But as Operation Blue Suede progressed, Elvis's role evolved into something more active and significantly more dangerous. Derber dakika, Budetaya kaçırma. In early 1959, intelligence analysts noticed something unexpected in the data Elvis was gathering. There was an underground network of rock and roll clubs in East Germany, operating in defiance of government restrictions. These clubs had become meeting points, not just for music fans, but for those disaffected with the Soviet-backed regime. This presented an unprecedented opportunity. If these underground clubs could be supported and expanded, they might form the nucleus of broader resistance movements. And Elvis, or rather the music and image of Elvis, could serve as their inspiration and rallying point. In February 1959, Elvis began a new phase of his mission. During carefully orchestrated weekend leaves, he would be driven to border areas. There, using techniques that remain partially classified, he would cross into East German territory for brief periods, usually under cover of darkness. The objective wasn't for Elvis himself to infiltrate the underground rock scene. He was far too recognizable. Instead, he served as a courier, bringing Western records, magazines, and occasionally more sensitive materials to contacts who would then distribute them to the underground network. James Milner, a former CIA officer who worked peripherally on the operation, explained in a 2018 interview, "It sounds almost comical now, using rock records as espionage tools. But cultural influence was a serious battlefield in the Cold War. Every kid in East Germany with a smuggled Elvis record was a kid who began questioning what their government was telling them. These missions were not without risk. The East German border was heavily patrolled, and being caught would have created an international incident of extraordinary proportions. To mitigate this risk, Elvis was given specialized training and always accompanied by experienced operatives, men who could blend into the background as part of his military entourage, but who were actually highly trained intelligence officers. One such mission in April 1959 nearly ended in disaster. According to declassified reports, Elvis and his team had successfully delivered a package of materials to a contact in a small town near Leipzig, when they encountered an unexpected patrol of Volkspolizei East German police. What happened next has become something of a legend among intelligence officers who were briefed on the operation. Surrounded and with no clear escape route, Elvis did the last thing anyone would expect. He began to sing. As the patrol approached, Elvis broke into an impromptu rendition of It's Now or Never, his powerful voice carrying through the quiet streets. The police officers, initially suspicious, were dumbfounded to discover what appeared to be the actual Elvis Presley serenading an East German street in the middle of the night. The absurdity of the situation created just enough confusion for Elvis's more experienced teammates to take control, convincing the officers that they were simply a group of off-duty American soldiers who had had too much to drink and taken a wrong turn, with one of them happening to be an exceptional Elvis impersonator. The team was escorted back to the border and released with a warning. The mission was a close call but ultimately successful. The delivered materials made it to their destination. While Elvis was engaged in these clandestine activities, his public image as a dutiful soldier continued to be carefully maintained. Photos of him cleaning his barracks, standing at attention, and practicing on the tank range were distributed to the press. The narrative was clear. Elvis was no prima donna. He was serving his country just like any other young American man. This public image was reinforced by his acquisition of a reputation as a model soldier. His commanding officers, many of whom were not aware of his intelligence activities, consistently praised his discipline and dedication. Sergeant Ira Jones, Elvis's platoon sergeant, would later tell reporters, "He was one of the best soldiers we had. He never took advantage of who he was. He could have sat back and rested on his fame, but he worked as hard as anyone." Of course, this perfect cover story helped facilitate his other work. Who would suspect that the dutiful Private Presley, so focused on being a good soldier, was slipping across borders in the dead of night? As 1959 progressed, Operation Blue Suede expanded. Intelligence gathered through Elvis's activities had identified key figures in the East German youth underground, young men and women who were hungry for Western culture and increasingly disillusioned with Soviet control. The operation shifted to focus on cultivating these potential assets. Elvis's missions now included targeted meetings with specific individuals who intelligence officers believed could become long-term sources or even organizers of resistance activities. One such individual was Margarete Schiller, a 19-year-old music student from East Berlin, who had formed one of the first all-girl rock bands behind the Iron Curtain. Declassified files describe her as highly intelligent, strongly opposed to Soviet influence, and widely respected in underground cultural circles. In June 1959, through an elaborate series of cutouts and intermediaries, Margarete was brought to a safe house near the border where she met with Elvis. The meeting was brief but impactful. Elvis provided her with rare records, Western musical equipment, hidden within the hollow body of an acoustic guitar, documents and instructions for establishing secure communication channels with Western intelligence. "He wasn't what I expected," Margarete would recall years later, after defecting to the West in 1962. "Everyone knew the hip-shaking rock star from the movies, but the man I met was serious, focused. He talked about music as freedom, as a universal language that could bring down walls before they were even built. I left that meeting ready to change my world." Margarete would go on to become one of the most valuable intelligence assets in East Germany, running a network of informants disguised as a music appreciation circle. Her code name in CIA files, Blue Suede Girl. As Elvis's military service approached its midpoint in late 1959, Operation Blue Suede faced a new challenge. Soviet intelligence had begun to notice patterns in border activities and underground movements. While they had no specific evidence implicating Elvis, increased security measures were making cross-border missions increasingly risky. The operation needed to evolve again, and it did so by moving into plain sight. In November 1959, Elvis's commanders announced that the famous private would perform a special Christmas concert for his fellow soldiers. The news made headlines around the world. What wasn't announced was that the concert venue, a large hangar on the Friedberg base, had been specifically chosen for its proximity to the East German border and the power of its sound system. On December 18, 1959, Elvis took to the stage in his uniform, performing for the first time since entering the army. The audience of American soldiers cheered as Elvis tore through his hits, Heartbreak Hotel, All Shook Up, Jailhouse Rock. But the real audience wasn't just in the hangar. The concert had been deliberately set up so that the sound would carry across the border. Listening posts confirmed that Elvis's performance could be clearly heard up to 3 miles inside East German territory. Thousands of East German citizens, alerted through the underground network Elvis had helped cultivate, gathered in fields and forests near the border to listen to this contraband concert. A CIA report filed 3 days later noted, Operation Soundwave successfully implemented. Estimated 2,000 plus East German civilians present in border vicinity. Multiple confirmed sightings of youth displaying prohibited Western symbols. Local authorities overwhelmed and unable to effectively disperse gatherings without causing significant incident. It was, as one intelligence officer later described it, psychological warfare via rock and roll. No cross-border movement was required. No materials needed to be smuggled, yet the impact was profound. For one night, American cultural influence had physically penetrated the Iron Curtain in the form of Elvis's voice. The concert marked a turning point in Operation Blue Suede. Direct infiltration missions were scaled back in favor of this new approach, using Elvis's music and image as tools of influence, delivered through the networks that had already been established. For the remainder of his military service, Elvis would participate in several more border concerts, each one carefully timed and positioned to reach audiences in the East. He also recorded special messages that were smuggled across the border on small concealable records, and played at underground gatherings. As Elvis's discharge date approached in March 1960, military intelligence faced the question of whether to extend Operation Blue Suede beyond his service. Ultimately, it was decided that the risks outweighed the benefits. Elvis would return to civilian life with no official acknowledgement of his classified activities. On March 2, 1960, as Elvis prepared to leave Germany, he had one final meeting with his handler, Captain Taylor. The captain shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. Elvis later told a trusted friend in one of the few instances where he ever referenced his classified work. He said, "Private Presley, you've served your country in ways that will never be known, but have made more difference than a division of tanks." Then he told me I was never to speak of any of it, and that as far as the world was concerned, I'd just been a regular soldier who did his duty. When Elvis returned to America, he stepped back into his public life, as if the intervening 2 years had been merely a brief intermission. He resumed his recording career, returned to making movies, and reclaimed his throne as the king of rock and roll. But those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. Elvis had always been interested in law enforcement and security matters, but after his army service, this interest intensified. He collected police badges, sought connections with the FBI, and even met with President Nixon in 1970 to discuss youth culture and offer his services in combating drug use. A meeting that many found bizarre at the time, but takes on new significance in light of what we now know about his intelligence background. The full impact of Operation Blue Suede is difficult to quantify. Intelligence operations by their nature work in indirect ways. But declassified analyses suggest that the cultural underground fostered during this operation played a meaningful role in maintaining Western influence behind the Iron Curtain during a critical period of the Cold War. Margarete Schiller, the Blue Suede Girl, continued her work until her defection in 1962. Her network eventually grew to include over 50 active members across East Germany, distributing Western music, literature, and ideas. Several of these individuals later became prominent in the peace and democracy movements that would ultimately contribute to the fall of the Berlin Wall. As for Elvis, he kept his oath of secrecy. Not once in interviews, private conversations, or memoirs did he directly reference his classified activities. The closest he ever came was during a 1972 press conference when asked about his military service. After giving the standard answer about being proud to serve his country like any other American, he added cryptically, "There's a lot more to that time than people know, but some things you just carry with you." Operation Blue Suede remained classified until 2018, when portions of it were released under a mandatory declassification review. Even now, certain operational details remain redacted, particularly those involving methods of border crossing and the identities of East German assets. The revelation of Elvis's secret Cold War role has forced historians to reevaluate both his personal legacy and the broader cultural dynamics of the Cold War. Far from being merely a victim of military service interrupting his career, Elvis was an active, if unwitting, participant in one of the most innovative intelligence operations of the era. James Burton, Elvis's friend and later his guitarist, perhaps summed it up best in a 2019 interview after learning of Elvis's classified activities. "It makes perfect sense when you think about it. Elvis changed the world with music. Why wouldn't they use that? The government saw what all of us saw, that Elvis had a power that went beyond entertainment. He could make people believe in something bigger than themselves." In the end, the story of Private Elvis Presley encompasses far more than just a famous entertainer doing his patriotic duty. It's a tale of how the most unlikely aspects of American culture, even something as seemingly frivolous as rock and roll, became powerful weapons in the shadow war against communism. The microphone and the firearm, it turns out, were not so different after all. Both could be instruments of power wielded by the right person at the right moment. And in the case of Operation Blue Suede, that person was a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who became not just the king of rock and roll but also for a brief and secret time an unlikely soldier in the silent battles of the Cold War. As Elvis himself once sang, a little less conversation, a little more action. Behind the Iron Curtain in 1959, those weren't just lyrics, they were operational doctrine.